Right, there we go. As John said, I've been associated with the Difficult Airways Society, and I'm also an executive of the Safe Airways Society, so thank you very much. I finally get to do a face-to-face meeting for SAS. I'm also one of the execs of the project for Universal Management of Airways, which has been going for a few years now, and we're finally starting to produce some stuff. What I'm going to do is talk through whether or not we actually, what is a Universal Airway Management Guideline? Do we need it, and what might it look like? All right. So that's our logo. I'm going to be really talking about stuff we've already published in the last couple of years. I think it's important to point out that this is fully multidisciplinary. Okay, so the concept document was written by Nick Crimes from anesthesia. I'm mainly an intensivist, and John Sackles is prof of emergency medicine in Tucson. It's a multidisciplinary group, and we are trying to come up with another airway management guideline. Now, isn't that good news? Okay, I think just to give you a bit of context, and airway management en masse in large numbers really started out in anesthesia. Anesthesia got its own customs and practices, became its own tribe, and then airway management spread to other disciplines, okay? And they themselves, they could think for themselves. They started developing their customs and practices, which were different to anesthesia. There is an underlying core, of course, but everyone went into their own silos, into their own tribes. And what we've seen since the ASA launched the first ever guideline in 1993, and I am old enough to have been in clinical practice before that, is a profusion of guidelines through all of the different specialty groups. And it doesn't matter, you will have your own view of what guidelines are, how they fit in, how useful they are. Some of you will think they're fantastic. Others, hopefully, will at least concede that they are useful. Some of you may just say they're just mother and apple pie, written by self-appointed great and good and their mates. Others will be even less charitable. Okay? I understand that. But it's very difficult to provide you with evidence that guidelines make a difference. This is one of my favourite slides, which I am going to claim shows it does make a difference. This is a slide showing the ASA close claims analysis of anaesthetic practice in North America, in the US. And it looks at claims for death and brain damage in two epochs of time, okay? 85 to 92 and 93 to 99, separated by the introduction in 93 of their guidelines. Now, there are loads of confounding variables, but there is a statistically significant and very, very noticeable reduction in the number and a heartening improvement in the nature of some of those. Now, I can remember before the widespread development of guidelines, DAS produced its own to the very early 2000s. And there was massive variation, even within one tribe, the anaesthetists, okay? It really was the Wild West, right? Everyone had their favourite bit of kit, everyone had their favourite technique, and they taught it well or badly according to. So what we're seeing is this profusion of guidelines, loads of them. This is actually 5 years out of date and is only for anaesthetists. Okay, if I was speaking to an ED audience, I'd have just a complex diagram, which for them, only for ED. So we may have reached peak guideline, and all these guidelines perhaps have become detrimental, I believe. Now, I'm guilty of writing some of them. So this is a big mea culpa, if you want. But I'm going to take as my basis the department in which I mainly work, right? Intensive care and anaesthesia at Warrington in Cheshire in the UK. And we are in Lovely Lane in Warrington. The Lovely Lane is a noun, not an adjective, but that's where we are. And my colleagues in the anaesthetic ICU departments have to be familiar with at least all of these. This is just one tribe, okay? And they have to, intubation, extubation, obstetrics, pediatrics, all of them. Many of them do pre-hospital medicine, and a lot of them do advanced pediatrics and retrieval stuff as well. So they have to be familiar with all of these, but they're all presented differently. They're formatted differently, they use different terms, they have different emphases, and that can actually, 95% of airway management guidelines are core. There are common themes, there are common ways of doing it. It's just that we describe them differently in the different guidelines. And that produces cognitive difficulty for even the most astute of practitioners. So what does a bright boy or girl do when they're faced with that kind of cognitive overload? Well, what they do, and you will do this naturally in your practice, is you essentially develop a healthy core. What you will do, if you have to practice across domains, is have what your core understanding of airway management is what you do in the vast majority of cases. Okay, there's plan A, B, C, D, but that is applicable across the board. Okay, and there will be slight derogations, whether or not you're dealing with a pregnant woman or a child or a critically ill person, and you will bolt those on to a central skeleton, the axial skeleton of airway management. And so what we're trying to do with Universal Guidelines is to make it simpler to understand and practice that core. So if you construct a Venn diagram of just 3 tribes, okay, what you see is the intensivist, emergency medicine, the emergency medics, and anesthesia. It doesn't actually, it's not really like that. It's more like that. And what we're trying to draw out in PUMA is precisely that, okay? To simplify it, to make it easier for you to apply the other guidelines, maybe even replace them, okay? So this is about making life easier for us all. Now, although I put that Venn diagram up, does that Venn diagram, and that is the vast majority of airway guidelines globally, is there a guideline in one of those circles which addresses the single most common airway intervention in the world, right? Which was the context for the most infamous airway death of modern times, the sad death of Elaine Bromley in the UK about 10 years ago. Okay? Well, the answer is no. Elaine Bromley was planned to have an elective laryngeal mask anaesthetic. None of the guidelines to date, she died of failed intubation, but she escalated to intubation. She started out as a laryngeal mask anaesthetic, and none of the guidelines cover that. So my colleagues have to have a working knowledge day in, day out of all those, and it doesn't actually cover the most common thing they do. Okay? And that's revealing. So in what way is PUMA, is it universal? Well, it's a product of the 21st century. We can actually speak to each other across geographies, across disciplines in real time. Okay, so I think I would stress the composition of this group. Okay, this is the working group, right? 11 anaesthesiologists, of those 11, 3 are primarily intensivists, 3 emergency physicians, but actually most importantly are, well, close to 70 members of the advisory group from around the world who, there will not be a specialty here that is not represented in that advisory group who have real-time input into the formulation of these guidelines, okay? It's fun arranging meetings. I have spent for the last 4 years of my life most alternate Saturday nights having a 2-hour video conference, much to the annoyance of my wife, with people across 9 time zones, and it doesn't matter how brilliant the people you're working with are, it is amazing how many really bright people can't tell the time. You know, just it's phenomenal how many people will log on an hour late, precisely 60 minutes late, but anyway, or 60 minutes early. So we've overcome geography, we've overcome disciplines. All of these disciplines are involved, and they all bring something to the table, right? Anaesthetists, obviously, we see an enormous breadth of airway practice and anaesthesia. They're the ones that use to plug airways a lot. They're the ones that do a lot of awake intubations. And you will all be familiar with the core strength of the anaesthetist. But everyone brings irreplaceable things to the table. The intensivists teach us, and the ED people as well, the physiological difficult airway. I was using high-flow nasal oxygen about 8 years in the intensive care unit, about 8 years before I ever used it for airway management. Okay, we do perc trachees in the DAS critical care guideline. We say that perc trachea, if you're good at it, is an acceptable form of emergency airway. Because if you've done rather a lot of perc trachees, you're actually quite good at getting into most airways. This is a very blurred picture of the Alfred Hospital where I was a senior registrar 20 years ago. And actually I saw the best intubation I have ever seen. It was actually of a guy in his 20s who was slim, fit, well, with what appeared to be a very straightforward airway. And indeed, he was a very straightforward airway. A monkey with a spoon could have intubated this guy. But what made it the best intubation I've ever seen is that two physician intensivists who didn't do airway management every single day of their lives actually did a textbook intubation, something I had never seen in my anaesthetic practice. They prepared for it, they used a checklist, they rehearsed what they were going to do, they had all the kit there. It was perfect. It actually was always going to be a very straightforward intubation, but it was a beauty to behold. They have a very healthy respect for airway management. Talked about, I've used airway exchange catheters. I'm involved in the DAS extubation guidelines. We use airway exchange catheters more in intensive care than we do in anaesthetic practice, for instance. This is, of course, Rich Levitan talking about O's at the nose. He was talking about apneic oxygenation before anyone in anaesthesia was. Okay, they nicked that idea and thrive and stuff like that. Okay, and they, of course, are experts in neck rescue, apneic oxygenation, physiological difficulties. This is him teaching his epiglotoscopy course over in the States. Scott Weingart, big player in airway management, ED physician, talks about priming for phono techniques. So they all of these people bring something to the table. ENT surgery we've heard of from this morning, well, they're experts at airway obstruction. In the UK, that last slide refers to, in the UK, there is now a joint statement from the ENT surgeons and anaesthetists and all of the airway managers saying what unified approach we're going to have to emergency airway management over e-phoners. So ENT, experts in airway obstruction, endoscopy, neck rescue. And of course airway assistance, because actually all the advances we're going to see in the rest of your career in airway management are going to be human factors. We've got the tools, and we're not, short of intravenous oxygen, which is probably about 10, 15 years away, we, in a deployable form, we are not going to get any more toys, or better toys, right? We've got the toys we need to learn how to use them, and we need to make the people that use them better. It's all about human factors of the team. Everyone brings something to the table. They're all in their independent silos. I mean, a little aside about silos and tribes. This is the guideline for tracheal intubation critical adults from 2018 DAS. Okay, this is the group that produced that. They're all intensivists in the UK. They're all anaesthetists in the UK as well. But NAT4 revealed my practice. Because my practice was, on a Monday morning, I would go to theatre, and if the ODP, the airway assistant, said the capnography machine wasn't working, fantastic, an extra 20 minutes in the coffee with it, okay? Because I wasn't going to go near a patient if the capnography wasn't working on a Monday. But on a Tuesday, we have 20 critical care beds. I would do a ward round of the 20 sickest patients in my hospital, many of them fully reliant on an artificial airway. None of them had capnography. Now, someday someone's going to write a fascinating PhD on the cognitive dissonance of airway managers. And that's not just a British problem. This is a worldwide problem. Only last year we published the InTube study from almost 200 centres, 29 countries, 5 continents of ICU intubations. Okay, and only 25% use waveform capnography. I think that is a problem we've solved in the UK. One thing we have solved in the UK, because the chief execs received a letter from the Department of Health saying they were going to be in trouble if they didn't provide capnography for the critical care intubations. And that is, hand on heart, 100% practice in the UK now. And I would expect something close to similar in Australia, but clearly not around the world. And most of the countries weren't developing countries. Okay, so tribe and tribal behaviour have real effects, because most of the deaths in the NAP4 were related to the absence of capnography. So my practice was inherently dangerous. I didn't even think about it, because on a Monday I belonged to that tribe, and on a Tuesday I swapped over to was wearing a different hat. Okay, so it's a unifying document, or a set of unifying documents. Different specialties, talked about that. In different contexts, everyone does different bits of airway management. We're going to cover that. The different phases, and essentially linking, crucially, evaluation to what you might do as an airway strategy. Linking what you find at evaluation, how you do an evaluation, you kind of know that already, but how do you use that evaluation to formulate a strategy? We've got that. That's coming out in the evaluation document is coming out probably in submission to the editor in the next 6 weeks, I would have thought. Implementation, contingency planning, that's airway rescue, extubation, and outcomes. Also, we address institutional preparedness, because it's not fair to put people in poor environments to manage difficult patients. This is the suite of guidelines, to use that phrase. It has actually been delayed, because I'm very proud to say that this meeting is the first in-person presentation of our first actual guideline, the prevention of unrecognised esophageal intubation, which we'll talk about this afternoon. But this is the first in-person presentation of that guideline. These were the original 6 planned. Okay, we're going to cover, or we do cover, in the papers which are in preparation, so the silent areas, airway management when the intended airway is a supraglottic airway or a face mask. I've talked about grading, assessment of risk, and how that might have implications for what we do as a management strategy. Video laryngoscopy and its role. For years, this question has been coming to the surface. Should you routinely use a video laryngoscope? Okay. There are loads of studies. I always look at the Cochrane collaborations if possible. This is the original Cochrane collaboration on video laryngoscopy from 2007, which certainly showed that across all patient groups, almost, and with all operators for easy and particularly difficult airways, provided you were trained with a video laryngoscope, your outcomes were better. But this year, if you've got time, there is a 6,000-page update of that guideline, done primarily by Jan Hansel from 15 miles down the road from us in Warrington, Manchester, and Tim Cook amongst others, and which basically updates that. So it goes to over 200 studies, 27,000 intubations, and showing that video laryngoscopy gives you a better view, higher first pass success rate, fewer attempts, lower failure rates, lower complication rates, improves team working, reduces hypoxia if you use a Mac-bladed or a channeled scope, and if anyone, we can discuss in questions whether or not hyperangulated video laryngoscopy causes more hypoxia which is controversial in some quarters, but MAC-bladed certainly reduces incidence of hypoxia and esophageal intubation, amongst other life-threatening complications. So this has been building for a while, and the Prevention of Unrecognised Esophageal Intubation Guideline published a couple of weeks ago, published about a month ago, and with an online launch 2 weeks ago, actually does say that we should be using a video laryngoscope routinely. Not routine video laryngoscopy, but doing laryngoscopy with a video laryngoscope. Okay? So you don't need to, so if anyone wants to tell me, oh, I'm worried about de-skilling and all the rest of it, well, use a MAC-bladed video laryngoscope and just do a normal intubation and look at the screen if you're having problems. There is no de-skilling issue there. Okay? So we've come off the fence and said this. But importantly, because of the universal nature of the endeavour we are engaged in, we have got endorsement from all of the world's major airway societies. Okay? UK and DAS, UK and Ireland, SAM, US, EAMS, EU, or India, Canadian Airway Focus Group, SAS, New Zealand, and IAMS, which I think it's safe to say is largely, it's run out of Philadelphia, but it's largely a Chinese organisation. Okay, so we have got endorsement from, and we've got EVLA as well, which isn't formally an airway society, so we can't actually use their logo, but they look after 22 of the Latin American countries, and they endorse it as well. So we've got global endorsement, global buy-in for the use of video laryngoscopy routinely, first go. I'm going to address poorly defined areas of practice, how to achieve the best effort. I think crimes might have something to do with that. But what is an RSI? The vexed question. Soft information I've touched on, and we'll talk more about this afternoon. But what is an RSI? RSI is now over 50 years old, and RSI is what is RSI? RSI is a bit like Brexit. It means something different to every single one of you, but you all expect it to mean what you think it means around when you're talking to everyone else. Okay? That is not only true, it's also potentially dangerous. Obviously, you want to avoid, that's what you want to avoid, but what is an RSI? It's a technique to minimize the risk of pulmonary aspiration during intubation. You all know that. But it means something different to every single one of you. And if you're relying on a team, and you're all singing from different hymn sheets, that may be problematic. And I would contend it is problematic. So we define it as minimizing the time interval between drug-induced loss of intrinsic airway reflexes and restoration of airway protection with a cuff tracheal tube with the cuff inflated. Now, people as old as me will recognize this because we were taught what a rapid sequence induction was. That was what, if you got asked that in your part 1 for examination for the Royal College of Anaesthetists, they would expect you to just go through those bullet points. You would pre-oxygenate with a set dose of thiopentone, follow it by succinylmethonium, set dose, no mass ventilation, apply 44 newtons of critical pressure, and which was only removed when the cuff was inflated. There was a black and white answer. But we all know it's been modified a bit since, hasn't it? But it's modified differently by everyone, differently. Okay? In the UK, there is a massive spread of what is meant by an RSI. Not just a British problem. Marco from Slovenia actually did this in about 20 countries. It's a worldwide phenomenon. Rapid sequence induction is almost a meaningless term. So, it's a good idea. How do we keep it? We improve it. We in PUMA say what an RSI is. RSI is really saying, I'm concerned about aspiration in this patient. Let's take steps to avoid it. How do you achieve that? Well, we've defined what an RSI is, and we've broken it down into essential, recommended, and operational parts. Okay? Essential, evidence-based, universal agreement, you do it, everyone does it, every single rapid sequence induction. Recommended, you should do it unless there's a good reason not to, and you should communicate whether or not you're going to not do it to your airway assistant and team. Optional, well, things that don't really fall into the categories, but there might be reasons to think it helps in that patient and that time with you and your team, but there's no evidence of widespread agreement. These are the parts of what we say a rapid sequence induction is and how they fit in. Optional, first of all, well, what goes in that? What might be included in that? Well, no specific hypnotic, use whatever you want. Removal of nasogastric tubes, but of course everyone wants to talk about cricoid pressure. It's something I've always taught the use of cricoid pressure, but it was interesting during COVID when I had a trained airway assistant at the patient's right shoulder, and I intubated most of our patients with COVID actually. And it was interesting that when my life was on the line, I asked the airway assistant not to press there, but to press there to give me a good mask seal. Interesting that I was prepared to bin it off, and I've taught it and believed in it all my life, but when my life was on the line, things were slightly different. But I still teach the use of cricoid pressure, but it should be implemented, what we say is, in accordance with local policies. If you're going to use it, release it. It is the only, perhaps, intervention in medicine which definitely is beneficial, because if you've given enough emergency anaesthetics, or in the ED, or in theatre, or in the ICU, you've seen cricoid used, you take off the cricoid, and the whole thing wells up with green stuff. If you've done lots, you've seen lots of that. So it definitely works in some people. Okay? But if it doesn't work, you can release it in under 1 second without any complications. So something potentially life-saving, which there are complications, but you can avoid them all in less than 1 second, no problem. Okay? So if you're going to use it, that's fine. But if it's thought to be impeding laryngoscopy, impeding passing of the tube, if it's impeding face mask ventilation, rescue oxygenation, take it off. If you're going to insert support airway, you've got to get into the hypopharynx, so you need to remove it then as well. Shouldn't be active vomiting in a paralysed patient, but if there is, take it off. All right? But a lot of human factors here. You should discuss with your assistant under what circumstances they're going to take that off, and they should be prompting you if any of those circumstances occur. It's all about teamwork. Avoidance of face mask ventilation prior to laryngoscopy. I think we've got over this now. It is acceptable to face mask ventilate, so we've reduced that to an optional component and bumped it up. You have to oxygenate the patient during attempts at laryngoscopy, and we recommend that you should be using some form of apneic oxygenation. In the essential components, we talk about, in terms of oxygenation, you've got to pre-oxygenate and use apneic oxygenation attempts between apneic oxygenation between attempts at laryngoscopy if you're not face mask ventilating, and you should face mask ventilate if they start to desaturate beyond a predetermined target. So we've defined what a modern rapid sequence induction is in the third decade of the 21st century. We've built in human factors, form of verbalization in the esophageal guideline we'll talk about this afternoon. We'll talk about mandating, describing the view you see at laryngoscopy and whether or not you get a sustained exhaled CO2 trace. We'll talk about that this afternoon. Language is important in a universal guideline. When you've written guidelines in the English language and you send it around the world for comment, one thing you do notice is that ephona doesn't translate very well into Spanish or Serbo-Croat, right? If you go to many of you, for instance, if I went to half my junior staff nurses on my intensive care unit and said I'm going to do ephona, I'm not entirely convinced that they have a clear, immediate understanding what ephona is, because some people call it CICO, some people call it SICO, some people call it cricothyroidotomy. Okay? There are about 20 different terms for that. We refer to it as a neck rescue. That translates beautifully in all languages, is intuitive and works. Okay? So that's just an example of the language. It's going to be iterative, it's going to be a living document online with free access, and it's going to be published in anesthesia journals, in ED journals, in ICU journals. Okay? So, it's yet another set of guidelines, but hopefully something which recognises that humans are humans, drawing out the core messages, all the important core messages from those guidelines, drawing them together and helping cognitive unloading of airway operators. So it's a unifying document and is aimed to improve retention for airway practitioners. So do we need universal airway management guidelines? I would contend that we do, and so do my colleagues on the group. So with that, I'll take questions. Thank you very much.